The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Colonel James Mitchell reviewed the daily briefings in his office. At 52, he commanded respect through 2 decades of distinguished service, his silver hair and stern demeanor reflecting countless missions and difficult decisions. The base operated with clockwork precision under his leadership, and he prided himself on maintaining the highest standards. His secretary knocked on the door, interrupting his concentration. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent and personal." The colonel glanced at his schedule, finding no appointments marked for this time. He frowned, already irritated by the disruption to his carefully planned day. "Send her in, but make it quick. I have a conference call with headquarters in 15 minutes, he replied, not bothering to look up from his papers. He assumed it was another military spouse with a complaint, or perhaps a journalist seeking an interview he had no intention of granting. The door opened, and footsteps echoed across the polished floor. When he finally raised his eyes, he saw a young woman in her mid-20s standing before his desk. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that had seen better days. There was something familiar about her face, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious nervousness in her posture. "My name is Sarah Chen. I served under your command in Afghanistan 3 years ago." The colonel's expression remained unchanged, though he studied her face more carefully now. He had commanded hundreds of soldiers over the years, and while he prided himself on remembering his troops, this particular face didn't immediately register in his memory. "I'm sorry, soldier, but I don't recall you from my unit," he said, leaning back in his chair with a dismissive tone. "Are you certain you have the right commanding officer? Perhaps you're thinking of someone else." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, I was part of the convoy that was ambushed on Route Amber in October 2021. You visited the hospital afterward, but I was unconscious at the time." She paused, searching his face for any sign of recognition. "I was the communications specialist in the 3rd vehicle." The colonel's memory stirred slightly. He remembered that particular ambush. It had been a devastating attack that claimed several lives and left others seriously wounded. However, the details of individual soldiers remained hazy, lost among countless similar incidents that blurred together in the harsh reality of military service. "That was a difficult day for all of us," he acknowledged. Though his tone remained formal and detached, many brave soldiers were injured in that attack. "If you're here seeking some form of recognition or compensation, I should direct you to the appropriate channels through Veterans Affairs." Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'm not here for money or medals, sir. I'm here because I need you to remember something important about that day, something that affects how you see the soldiers under your command." The colonel glanced at his watch, growing increasingly impatient with what he perceived as another emotional appeal from a former soldier seeking closure or validation. "Miss Chen, I appreciate your service, but I have pressing matters to attend to. If you'll excuse me," he said, beginning to rise from his chair in a clear signal that the meeting was over. His dismissive attitude reflected years of dealing with similar visits from former soldiers, each carrying their own burdens and seeking something he felt unable to provide. But Sarah remained standing, her feet planted firmly on the ground. "Colonel, please, just give me 5 more minutes. I need to show you something that will help you understand why this matters." There was something in her voice, a quiet determination mixed with pain, that made him pause, though his expression remained skeptical. 3 minutes, he said curtly, settling back into his chair. "But I warn you, if this is some attempt to relitigate past decisions or question my command, this conversation ends immediately." His words carried the weight of authority, but also revealed his discomfort with emotional confrontations that challenged his professional distance. Sarah nodded, understanding that she had only one chance to make her point. She reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out a folder containing medical records and photographs. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the colonel's desk, the weight of 3 years of struggle evident in her movements. "Sir, I want you to understand what happened that day from my perspective," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When the IED exploded, I was thrown from the vehicle along with Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Williams. The blast was so powerful that it flipped our armored transport completely over. Colonel Mitchell glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them, his body language still conveying reluctance to engage deeply with her story. He had heard countless war stories over the years, each one tragic in its own way, but he had learned to maintain emotional distance as a survival mechanism in his role as a leader. The medical report shows that I suffered severe trauma to my torso and legs, Sarah continued, opening the folder to reveal X-ray images and surgical photographs. But what it doesn't show is how I crawled 15 meters through enemy fire to reach Rodriguez, who was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a head wound. The colonel's eyes briefly scanned the medical documents, noting the extensive surgical procedures and rehabilitation notes. Despite his attempts to remain detached, he could see that her injuries had been substantial and life-threatening. The clinical language of the reports painted a picture of someone who had endured months of painful recovery. I managed to apply pressure to his wounds and call for medical evacuation using my radio, even though my own injuries were severe, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone who had recounted this story many times to medical professionals and therapists. The medics later said that my actions saved Rodriguez's life. That's commendable, the colonel replied, though his tone remained formal. Acts of heroism under fire are what we expect from our soldiers. You should be proud of your service. His response reflected the standard military approach to such situations. Acknowledge the sacrifice while maintaining professional distance. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes intensifying. But sir, when you visited the hospital 2 days later, you spoke to Rodriguez and Williams. You presented them with commendations for their bravery and took photographs with their families. The press covered your visit extensively. She pulled out a newspaper clipping showing the colonel shaking hands with the 2 male soldiers. Their proud families gathered around hospital beds. The colonel examined the photograph, his memory beginning to sharpen as he recalled the media event that had been organized to boost morale and public support for the mission. He remembered the careful staging of the visit, the presence of photographers, and the positive coverage that had resulted from highlighting the heroism of American soldiers. I remember that visit, he admitted, his tone becoming slightly less dismissive. It was important for the families and for public morale to recognize their sacrifice and recovery. He set the photograph down, but his expression suggested he still didn't understand why Sarah was bringing this to his attention. But Colonel, Sarah said, her voice growing more intense, when the nurse mentioned that there was a 3rd soldier from the same vehicle who had also acted heroically, you laughed and said, well, if he's that tough, he doesn't need a visit from me. You assumed I was male, and when the nurse tried to correct you, you were already walking away. The colonel's brow furrowed as he tried to recall this specific interaction. The detail was lost among hundreds of similar hospital visits and public appearances over the years. His dismissive comment, if he had indeed made it, would have been the kind of casual remark that reflected assumptions about combat roles and heroism. I don't recall making such a statement, he said carefully, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. But even if I did, it was likely just a misunderstanding about your identity and condition at the time. His defensive response revealed his discomfort with the implication that his actions might have been influenced by unconscious bias. Sarah reached into her bag once more, this time pulling out her phone. Actually, sir, the nurse recorded part of your visit that day. Her daughter was a journalism student, and she thought it would make a good story about military leadership and care for wounded soldiers. She held up the phone, her finger hovering over the play button. The colonel's office fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah's phone sat on the desk between them like a small judge waiting to deliver its verdict. Colonel Mitchell stared at the device with growing apprehension, realizing that whatever was about to play could fundamentally change the nature of their conversation. Sir, I want you to hear exactly what happened, Sarah said softly, pressing the play button. The audio quality was somewhat muffled, clearly recorded from a phone hidden in someone's pocket, but the voices were distinctly audible. The first voice belonged to a nurse with a slight southern accent. Colonel Mitchell, it's such an honor to have you here visiting our wounded heroes. The nurse's voice crackled through the small speaker. Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Williams have been looking forward to meeting you all week. Their families are so proud. Background noise included the beeping of medical equipment and distant conversations typical of a busy military hospital. The colonel's own voice came through clearly, confident and warm in the way he had perfected for public appearances. The honor is mine, nurse. These soldiers represent the finest of American military tradition. Their sacrifice and courage in the face of enemy fire exemplifies everything we stand for. His recorded voice carried the practiced cadence of someone comfortable with media attention. Sarah watched the colonel's face as he listened to himself, noting the slight tension that appeared around his eyes. She could see him trying to place this specific interaction among the dozens of similar hospital visits he had conducted over the years. The recording continued with sounds of movement and conversation as the colonel apparently moved between hospital beds, speaking with the wounded soldiers and their families. His voice carried genuine warmth as he presented commendations and posed for photographs, clearly comfortable in his role as a leader honoring his troops. Then came the crucial moment. The nurse's voice returned, slightly more hesitant this time. "Colonel, sir, there's actually a third soldier from that same convoy who showed remarkable heroism that day. Specialist Chen is still recovering from extensive surgery, but the medics said her actions under fire saved Sergeant Rodriguez's life." There was a brief pause in the recording, filled only with the ambient sounds of the hospital. Then came the colonel's response, and Sarah watched his face carefully as his own voice played back his words from 3 years ago. "Well, if he's that tough, he doesn't need a visit from me," came the colonel's recorded voice, followed by what was unmistakably laughter. The tone was casual and dismissive, the kind of offhand comment that revealed underlying assumptions about military service and heroism. The nurse's voice returned, slightly firmer now. "Actually, sir, Specialist Chen is a woman and her injuries are quite severe. She's been unconscious for most of the past 2 days, but the doctors expect her to make a full recovery. Her parents flew in from California yesterday." But the recording captured only the sound of footsteps moving away and the colonel's voice becoming more distant as he apparently continued to the next patient without acknowledging the correction. The nurse could be heard sighing quietly before the recording ended. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Colonel Mitchell sat motionless, his face cycling through a range of expressions as he processed what he had just heard. The casual dismissal in his own voice was undeniable, as was the clear correction from the nurse that he had chosen to ignore. Sarah carefully placed her phone back in her bag, giving the colonel time to absorb what had just transpired. She could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he confronted the gap between his self-perception as a fair and caring leader and the reality of his recorded actions. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence, "I'm not here to embarrass you or to seek revenge for that slight. What happened that day wasn't about me personally. It was about assumptions that affect how female soldiers are seen and valued in combat situations." The colonel's hands moved restlessly on his desk, straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. His professional composure, so carefully maintained throughout his career, was beginning to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence of his own unconscious bias. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, his voice notably softer than before, "I need to understand something. If this recording has existed for 3 years, why are you bringing it to me now? What's changed that made you decide to confront me with this?" Sarah met his gaze directly, her brown eyes reflecting both pain and determination. "Because yesterday, sir, I received news that will affect not just my future, but the future of other female soldiers who might serve under your command." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward in his chair, his earlier impatience replaced by genuine concern and curiosity. The recording had shattered his defensive posture, leaving him more open to understanding the deeper implications of Sarah's visit. The morning light streaming through his office windows seemed different now, casting sharper shadows that matched the clarity beginning to emerge in his mind. "What news?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the dismissive authority that had characterized their conversation just minutes earlier. For the first time since Sarah had entered his office, he was truly listening, not just waiting for an opportunity to end the meeting. Sarah took a deep breath, her composure wavering slightly as she prepared to share something deeply personal. "Yesterday I received confirmation that I've been selected for a new position training combat medics at Fort Bragg. It's a significant promotion and exactly the kind of role I've been working toward since my recovery." The colonel nodded, uncertain where this was leading but sensing the importance of the moment. "Congratulations," he said carefully. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity for someone with your experience and proven courage under fire." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, then paused before continuing. But here's what you need to understand about the cost of that courage. When I made the decision to crawl through enemy fire to save Rodriguez, I wasn't thinking about heroism or recognition. I was thinking about my training and my responsibility to my fellow soldiers. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a different set of photographs. These were not official medical records, but personal images that told a more intimate story of her recovery. The photos showed extensive scarring across her torso and legs, the aftermath of multiple surgeries and skin grafts. The shrapnel from the IED tore through my body armor and embedded in my chest, abdomen, and both legs, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone who had discussed these injuries countless times with medical professionals. The surgeons had to remove 17 pieces of metal, some of them dangerously close to vital organs. Colonel Mitchell examined the photographs, his military training allowing him to understand the severity of the wounds even without medical expertise. The scarring was extensive, telling the story of trauma that went far beyond what he had initially comprehended from the official reports. But the physical scars weren't the most difficult part of my recovery, Sarah continued, carefully returning the photos to her folder. The emotional and psychological impact of feeling invisible, of having my sacrifice dismissed because of assumptions about my gender and capabilities, that took much longer to heal. The colonel set down the photographs, his expression growing more somber as he began to grasp the full scope of what had transpired. Sarah, I want you to know that my failure to visit you in the hospital was not intentional discrimination. It was thoughtlessness, but that doesn't excuse the impact of my actions. I understand that, sir, Sarah replied. But what I need you to understand is that this pattern of unconscious bias affects more than just individual soldiers. It shapes how female service members are perceived, valued, and remembered. When heroic actions are overlooked because they don't fit expected narratives, it sends a message about who counts as a real soldier. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of her words. In his 20-plus years of military service, he had prided himself on being fair and merit-based in his leadership approach. The revelation that his unconscious assumptions had led to such a significant oversight forced him to question other decisions and interactions throughout his career. Tell me about your recovery, he said finally. Help me understand what you went through after that day. His request was genuine, born from a growing recognition that he needed to confront the full consequences of his actions and assumptions. Sarah shifted in her chair, clearly preparing to share something difficult. The physical rehabilitation took 8 months. I had to relearn how to walk properly, rebuild strength in my core muscles, and manage chronic pain from nerve damage. But during that entire time, I struggled with feeling like my service and sacrifice had been erased. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I watched Rodriguez and Williams receive their commendations, give interviews about their experience, and become symbols of American military heroism. Meanwhile, I was fighting to prove that I deserved to return to active duty, that my injuries hadn't made me a liability to future missions. The colonel found himself imagining the isolation and frustration Sarah must have experienced during those months of recovery. The contrast between the public recognition received by her male comrades and her own invisible struggle painted a picture that challenged his assumptions about fairness and merit in military culture. But you did return to active duty, he observed. You rebuilt your career and earned this new position at Fort Bragg. That speaks to remarkable resilience and determination. His comment was meant as recognition, but Sarah's response suggested the story was more complex than simple triumph over adversity. Yes, I returned, she said, but not without cost, and not without learning some painful truths about how the military views female soldiers, especially those who challenge conventional expectations about courage and combat effectiveness. The weight of Sarah's words settled over the office like morning fog, obscuring the colonel's previous certainties about his leadership and judgment. He found himself studying her face more carefully, seeing past the initial impression of a young woman seeking attention to recognize a seasoned soldier who had endured both physical and emotional battles. What painful truths? Colonel Mitchell asked, his voice softer than it had been since the conversation began. The transformation in his demeanor was evident, from dismissive authority figure to someone genuinely seeking to understand a perspective he had never considered. Sarah leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing as she sensed the colonel's growing receptiveness to her message. During my rehabilitation, I connected with other female veterans who had similar experiences. Women who had performed acts of courage under fire, who had saved lives and completed dangerous missions, but whose stories were never told or celebrated in the same way as their male counterparts. She pulled out her phone again, but this time to show him photographs rather than play audio. The images showed a group of women in military uniforms at what appeared to be an informal gathering. Their faces bore the confident expressions of experienced soldiers, but their eyes reflected shared understanding of challenges beyond combat. "This is a support group we formed," Sarah explained. "Lieutenant Martinez saved an entire convoy by detecting and disarming an IED, but she was never recommended for commendation because her commanding officer felt it was just doing her job." Sergeant Thompson pulled 3 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle, but was told that publicizing her actions might send the wrong message about women in combat roles. Colonel Mitchell studied the photographs, beginning to see a pattern that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Each story Sarah shared challenged his assumption that the military was a meritocracy where courage and competence were recognized regardless of gender. "These women taught me that my experience wasn't isolated," Sarah continued. "There's a systematic tendency to overlook or downplay female heroism, especially when it involves the kind of aggressive, life-saving actions traditionally associated with male soldiers. The narrative of military heroism has very specific expectations about who fits the role of a hero." The colonel set down the phone, his mind racing through memories of his own career and the decisions he had made about recognition and advancement. How many times had he unconsciously applied different standards or made assumptions based on gender? How many Sarah Chens had he overlooked without even realizing it? "But what does this have to do with your new position?" he asked, trying to understand the connection between her personal experience and her current situation. "Because, sir, my new role involves training the next generation of combat medics, many of whom will be women entering increasingly dangerous positions," Sarah replied. "I want to ensure that their courage and competence are recognized and valued equally, regardless of their gender. But I also know that commanding officers like yourself will play a crucial role in determining how these soldiers are perceived and treated." The colonel nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the broader implications of their conversation. Sarah wasn't just seeking personal vindication. She was trying to address a systemic issue that could affect countless future soldiers. "Yesterday, when I received confirmation of my new assignment, I realized I had a choice," Sarah continued. "I could let the past remain buried and focus on moving forward. Or I could use this opportunity to help you understand how unconscious bias affects real soldiers in real situations." She paused, her expression becoming more intense. "I chose to come here because I believe you're a good leader who made a mistake, not a bad leader who doesn't care. The fact that you're listening now, even though it's uncomfortable, suggests that you're capable of growth and change." Colonel Mitchell felt a complex mix of emotions: embarrassment at his past behavior, respect for Sarah's courage in confronting him, and concern about how many other soldiers he might have failed in similar ways. The conversation was forcing him to confront blind spots he hadn't known existed. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly," he said, his voice carrying new humility. "What do you want from me? What would make this conversation worthwhile for you and for the soldiers you're concerned about?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, and for the first time since entering his office, she smiled slightly. "I want you to see the shrapnel wounds, sir. Not just mine, but all the invisible wounds that female soldiers carry when their service is diminished or overlooked. I want you to understand that heroism doesn't have a gender, and that recognition shouldn't depend on whether someone fits traditional expectations." The colonel was quiet for several moments, processing the metaphor and its implications. The shrapnel wounds Sarah referred to were not just physical injuries, but the emotional and professional damage caused by bias and oversight, and I want you to use your influence and authority to ensure that other commanders understand this too, Sarah added, because the soldiers I'll be training deserve leaders who see their full potential and value their contributions equally. Colonel Mitchell rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds where young soldiers were conducting morning exercises. From his vantage point, he could see both male and female recruits working together, their movements synchronized and purposeful. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering about the individual stories and struggles of each person under his command. "Sarah," he said without turning around, I need to tell you something that I've never acknowledged, even to myself." His voice carried the weight of someone preparing to confront a difficult truth. "Throughout my career, I've prided myself on being an objective leader who judges soldiers solely on their performance and potential." He turned back to face her, his expression more vulnerable than it had been at any point during their conversation. "But listening to that recording, hearing my own casual dismissal of your sacrifice, I realized that I've been carrying unconscious assumptions that have affected my decisions in ways I never recognized." Sarah remained silent, allowing him the space to process and articulate his thoughts. She could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he grappled with the gap between his self-perception and his actual behavior. "When I made that comment about you being tough enough not to need a visit, I was operating from a stereotype about female soldiers," the colonel continued. "I assumed that if you were truly heroic, you would fit a certain masculine model of toughness that doesn't require emotional support or recognition." He returned to his desk, but remained standing, his posture more open and less defensive than before. "What I failed to understand is that courage and strength come in many forms, and that recognition isn't about weakness. It's about validation of service and sacrifice." Sarah nodded, appreciating his willingness to examine his own biases honestly. "Sir, what matters most is not the mistake you made 3 years ago, but what you choose to do with this awareness going forward." The colonel looked at the photographs and documents spread across his desk, each piece of evidence telling a story he had initially failed to see or value. "I want to understand the full scope of this problem. How many other soldiers have had similar experiences? How many times have I and other commanders made decisions based on unconscious bias?" "More than you might expect," Sarah replied honestly. "But the encouraging thing is that these issues can be addressed when leaders are willing to acknowledge them and take concrete steps to change institutional culture." The colonel sat back down, his demeanor now completely focused on problem-solving rather than defense. "What specific steps would you recommend? How can I ensure that my command policies and practices recognize and value all forms of heroism and service?" Sarah had clearly prepared for this question, pulling out a folder containing research and recommendations. "First, review your recognition and advancement processes to identify potential bias points. Look at patterns in who receives commendations, promotions, and high-profile assignments. Sometimes the numbers tell a story that individual decisions don't reveal." She handed him several documents outlining best practices for equitable leadership in military settings. "Second, implement training for your staff about unconscious bias and its impact on military culture. Many commanders want to be fair but lack awareness of how their assumptions affect their decisions." The colonel examined the materials, noting the practical nature of her suggestions. These weren't abstract theories, but concrete steps that could be implemented within existing military structures. "Third," Sarah continued, "create opportunities for diverse voices to be heard in decision-making processes. Sometimes bias is countered simply by having multiple perspectives involved in evaluating performance and potential." "These recommendations seem reasonable and actionable," the colonel said, his tone now collaborative rather than authoritative. "But I need to ask, are you willing to work with me on implementing these changes? Your perspective and experience would be invaluable in ensuring we get this right." Sarah considered his offer carefully. "Sir, I'm committed to addressing these issues, but I also need to focus on my new responsibilities at Fort Bragg. However, I'd be willing to consult on policy development and to connect you with other female veterans who have expertise in this area." The colonel nodded, understanding her position while appreciating her willingness to contribute to positive change. "I want to start by formally acknowledging your heroism from that day in Afghanistan. I should have recognized your actions 3 years ago, and I want to correct that oversight now." "I appreciate that, sir," Sarah replied. "But what would mean more to me is knowing that future female soldiers won't face the same oversight and assumptions that I encountered. Recognition for past actions is important, but preventing future bias is essential." The colonel stood up again, this time with a sense of purpose rather than restlessness. "Sarah, I want to make you a promise. Within the next month, I will implement a comprehensive review of our recognition and advancement processes. I will also establish training programs to address unconscious bias among my command staff." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "But more importantly, I will carry the memory of this conversation with me every time I make decisions about the soldiers under my command. Your courage in coming here today has taught me something crucial about leadership that I should have learned years ago. 6 months later, Colonel Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Military Leadership Conference, addressing an audience of senior officers from across all branches of service. The transformation in his perspective had rippled through his command and beyond, creating waves of change that extended far past his initial conversation with Sarah Chen. Leadership requires the courage to confront our own blind spots, he told the assembled officers, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned wisdom. Today, I want to share with you a story about how one soldier's courage taught me more about effective command than 2 decades of traditional military training. In the audience, Sarah sat in the 3rd row, now wearing the uniform of her new rank as a senior instructor at Fort Bragg. She had been invited to attend the conference as a consultant on the new bias awareness programs that were being implemented across multiple military installations. Her work training combat medics had gained recognition not just for its technical excellence but for its innovative approach to fostering inclusive leadership among future military medical personnel. 6 months ago, a former soldier visited my office, the colonel continued, not naming Sarah but catching her eye briefly in the audience. She came to show me something I had failed to see 3 years earlier, that heroism doesn't conform to our preconceptions, and that our assumptions as leaders can render invisible the very courage we claim to value most. The colonel went on to describe the systematic changes he had implemented in his command structure. Recognition processes had been redesigned to include multiple review perspectives, ensuring that heroic actions were evaluated based on impact rather than assumptions about who could be heroic. Training programs now addressed unconscious bias as a leadership competency, not just a theoretical concept. The results have been measurable, he reported to the audience. Female soldiers in my command are now receiving commendations and advancement opportunities at rates proportional to their service and contributions. But more importantly, we've created a culture where all soldiers feel that their courage and competence will be recognized and valued. After the presentation, Sarah approached the colonel during the networking reception. Their relationship had evolved from that tense confrontation in his office to a respectful collaboration focused on institutional change. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for your commitment to following through on the promises you made that day," Sarah said, extending her hand in a gesture of professional respect. "The changes you've implemented are already affecting how female soldiers are perceived and treated throughout the military." The colonel shook her hand firmly, his expression reflecting genuine gratitude rather than the defensive authority he had displayed months earlier. "Sarah, I should be thanking you. Your courage in confronting me with hard truths has made me a better leader and has improved the lives of countless soldiers under my command." They were joined by several other officers who had attended the colonel's presentation and wanted to learn more about implementing similar programs in their own commands. Sarah found herself at the center of discussions about policy changes, training development, and cultural transformation within military leadership. "The most important thing to understand," Sarah explained to the group, "is that bias isn't necessarily intentional discrimination. Often it's the result of unconscious assumptions that affect how we interpret actions and evaluate potential. Good leaders can make biased decisions without realizing it, but great leaders create systems that help them recognize and counter those biases." Later that evening, as the conference wound down, Sarah and the colonel found themselves in a quieter conversation away from the crowds. Both reflected on how dramatically their relationship and perspectives had changed since that morning 6 months ago. "I have a confession," the colonel said with a slight smile. "When you first walked into my office that day, I thought you were going to be another problem to manage, another emotional situation to diffuse quickly so I could get back to my real work." Sarah laughed. The tension and pain of their first encounter now transformed into shared understanding and mutual respect. "And I thought you were going to be another commander too set in his ways to acknowledge that he might have blind spots that affected his soldiers." "We were both wrong about each other," the colonel observed. "But more importantly, we were both willing to move past our initial assumptions and engage in the hard work of real change." As they prepared to part ways, Sarah pulled out her phone one final time. But instead of playing a recording that revealed past failures, she showed the colonel a video from her recent training program at Fort Bragg. The footage showed diverse groups of combat medics working together, learning not just technical skills but leadership principles that emphasized recognition and value for all forms of service. "This is what change looks like in practice," Sarah said, watching the colonel's face as he observed the collaborative, inclusive environment she had helped create. "It's not just about correcting past mistakes. It's about building a future where those mistakes become impossible because the systems and culture support equity and recognition for everyone." Colonel Mitchell nodded, understanding that their conversation 6 months ago had been just the beginning of an ongoing transformation. The shrapnel wound Sarah had asked him to see, both literal and metaphorical, had taught him that true military leadership required the courage to examine not just external enemies but internal assumptions that could undermine the very soldiers he was sworn to protect and support. "Sarah," he said as they shook hands one final time, "thank you for not letting me dismiss you with a laugh. Thank you for making me see what I had failed to recognize. And thank you for showing me that the most important battles we fight as leaders are often the ones that help us become worthy of the soldiers we have the privilege to command."